Hello everyone, and welcome to this video, which is in our engine opening series. I'm Grandmaster Matthew Sadler, and in this video we're taking a look at a variation of the Scandinavian as fought out by Minic and Nemorino in the TCEC Season 22 Swiss 3. So Nemorino and Minic fight out a very sharp tactical battle in the Qa5 Scandinavian. It revolves around white, Minic's attempt to prevent black from establishing a bishop on f5, very natural square in the Scandinavian for the light squared bishop. I hadn't actually realised that it was even possible to fight this, so this is a very unusual variation. There were a couple of over-the-board games and one correspondence game, but apart from that, I think white players have been largely ignorant of this, so very, very interesting. How did it come up? Well, e4, d5, takes, queen takes d5, knight c3, queen a5, the queen a5 Scandinavian, d4, knight f6, bishop d3, and now c6. And this was the last book move. Bishop d3 has been played quite a lot, and c6 is the most common response to that. Now, I always thought you played bishop d3 like this quickly to play knight e2, just to try and avoid a pin on the knight on f3 by bishop g4. But Minic played knight f3 anyway, and here Nemorino played bishop f5, which looks like the really the most aggressive, the most direct. Just white's offer the light squared bishop on d3, so try and exchange it, exchange off pieces, free a bit of space in your position. You know, black should be fine. Just having a quick look at bishop g4, that was played by Minic as black against Nemorino in the reverse. And, well, this was a nice position for white. Black did the pretty typical Scandinavian thing of giving up both bishops for the two knights. But in this position, Nemorino definitely, well, it felt as if Nemorino was making headway in this way. You know, some obviously weak double pawns, some things to hold white back. You know, black is reasonably solid. But still, I mean, I much prefer white in this position. But Nemorino as black played much more sharply, bishop f5. Now, a lot of white players have just simply castled in this position, but, well, that does really just give black exactly what black wants. There's a much sharper continuation, and that's the one that Minic played. It played the move b4. What's the point of b4? It stops the queen protecting the bishop on f5. The queen can't keep that protection up. So black has to take the gift and, well, counterattack the loss of the piece on f5 with an attack on the knight on c3. So bishop f5, queen takes c3 check, bishop d2, and now, yeah, black has to start thinking about where to put the queen. Very natural place, and that's the place that Nemorino chose, is c4. What does c4 do? Well, it prevents the white king from castling kingside by covering the f1 square. And it also stops moves like queen e2 from white. So it exerts a certain cramping influence on white's position. Now, there was an over-the-board game played in 1996 between two very aggressive American players, Nick DeFermian and Larry Christensen. Nick played rook b1, b5, bishop d3, queen d5, castles, e6, with compensation for the pawn, but yeah, no, probably not that much more than that. What Minic did was much more aggressive and has actually been seen in one correspondence game before, and that's the move bishop c8. Very unusual idea in the opening, but just attacking the pawn on b7, which is very hard to defend. I mean, what can you do? Queen a6, I'll just go rook b1, and you're pinned, I'm just going to grab the b7 pawn. And of course, if you don't do anything, then just bishop b7 will win the rook on a8. So knight bd7 was played by Nemorino, bishop takes b7, rook b8, rook b1, and now e6. And pretty interesting position, really. I mean, in some ways, well, my expectation was that white should really be so much better here, simply because You know, black's tried something sharp and you've reacted, and you've got your bishop into the position and destroyed some queenside structure, which is normally very, very solid for black in the Scandinavian. And the black king's, you know, still in the centre. So they feel like there's tactics as well, with bishop c6 discovered attacks. Feels like all sorts of things could happen. However, you know, black isn't that far behind in development, and a very important piece is this queen, which, well, is stopping white from castling, certainly stopping white from developing any attack. But there's another point to the queen, which is not obvious, first of all, is that it's actually restricting the bishop's escape routes. So, yeah, I mean, the bishop can't actually get back to a6, for example. That does actually mean that black's got a severe threat in this position, which is to play the knight to b6, blocking the protection of the rook on the bishop on b7, and actually trapping that bishop on b7. So actually there's, although you might not quite realise it at first glance, there's actually quite a bit of urgency for white to actually do something and get something done. So queen e2, pardon me, is the white's choice. And it's a very good one. I mean, if you exchange off queens, white's got the two bishops, weak queen side to aim for, better development now because the king's on e2, the rooks are connected, so that would just be very, very positive indeed. And here, very big choice for black. So queen a4 was played by Nemorino, and we'll have a look at that later. I actually spent a lot of time without an engine. I was in the train for travelling on business, so I could just play around on my little pocket chess set, and I got quite interested in queen takes c2. You know, what would be the problem with that? So after queen c2, you play castles, and then black's task is simply to develop. That bishop's got to be developed either to e7 or to d6, and then the king's got to get castled. And what's black's aim? Well, black's aim really is to take the pawn on a2 as well, and you might lose you know, these queenside pawns, a7 and c6 as well, but you'll have just flattened out the position completely, all the pawns on one side, and hopefully your queen won't be getting trapped. I mean, there are a lot of squares there. And the first line that I looked at was bishop e7, and this is very, very interesting, but actually turns out to be very, very good for white. So I go knight e5, knight takes e5, and then d takes e5. I take on e5 because after castles, knight c6 forks rook and bishop, and rook takes b7, knight e7 check, followed by rook b7 is just a rook win for white. So after knight takes e5, d takes e5, yeah, knight d7 is forced. If you go to d5, I've got this uncovered attack, and rook takes b8 after. So knight d7, and now rook c1, queen a2, and bishop c6 was what I wanted. And at first glance, you know, this bishop on c6 attacks the knight on d7, prevents the black king from castling. And well, if that's the case, then black's going to be in real trouble. However, I got very, very interested by this idea, just playing castles. And the idea is that if you play bishop takes d7, then black's actually got a number of big pins in the position. Rook b2, pinning the bishop to the queen, and rook d8, pinning this bishop to the bishop on d2 as well. I mean, these are the type of lines I used to spend a lot of time on as a professional, you know, always trying to stretch the boundaries of what you can do. If you can get away with this as black, just get the piece back in some way, then this is a brilliant way to trick your opponent. You know, very hard for an opponent to see from afar, you know, how dangerous this could be. However, yeah, yeah, you do have to prove it, and actually it's not at all easy. I spent some time, by the way, looking at rook a1 first to force queen b2, bishop takes d7, which I thought might be better because it doesn't allow the rook to b2, but well, we'll have a quick look at it later. But this didn't turn out to be good at all. Actually, it turned out to be good for black. Well, I'll just show you the line quickly. Rook fd8 pins the bishop to the to this bishop. If we go rook a7 simply, then I go bishop c5, rook c7, bishop b6, and you can't defend the bishop anymore with your rook, so you lose that one. And after that, black's actually just better because well, we've still got the pin on the bishop on d2. So yeah, I mean, that's really, really bad, and an ugly move like queen d3, just defending there. Actually, we just go rook b3, and the queen's got no square at all to keep on defending this bishop. So we just pick it up on the next move. So bishop d7, immediately I eventually figured out that this had to be the attempt. And now we've got a couple of ideas here for black. And the most obvious one is to play rook fd8. I think, just pinning this bishop to the bishop on d2, and it just looks like, well, this just looks just very, very good somehow, right? And I mean, but White's got an amazing idea here. White's actually got this move queen d3, and I couldn't actually make this work at all for black. And well, when I came back home and checked it with an engine, it well, said, you're completely right. That's it is again just very, very good for black. The big problem is that if you go anything like rook b7 to try and hit the bishop, I've got this move rook c8. It's very important actually, because there's it also looks like you could just play the move rook a1, which looks very strong. You're attacking this queen on a2, and queen to b2 would be met by rook b1, pinning the queen against the rook. But actually black's got an amazing resource here, can just take on a1, rook a1, and rook bd7. And then you're going to pick up the bishop on d2, and you're going to be fine in this position. I mean, you'll have just a rook and bishop for the queen when all the pawns are on one side. And there's also, some sort of possibilities of attacking f2 with a rook on the 7th and a bishop on c5. That's going to be absolutely fine for black. But after rook b7, you can simply go rook c8, and you force the exchange of rooks. Rook d7, I've just met by queen d7. And once you've swapped off a pair of rooks there, then yeah, white's just a piece up. So just an amazingly important resource, but quite hard to visualize, really, that the queen d3, that it's possible to self-pin your bishop like that. I worked it out, but yeah, it was after having to overcome a lot of ingrained, inbuilt prejudice. The other idea for black is to play rook b2. And then rook d1, and again, amazingly enough, none of the pins that we've got work. Rook d8 is again met by queen d3. We just unpin from here, and obviously rook b7 met by rook c8 again. But we've got some other pins. If we go bishop g5, the key resource all the time is to go rook a1. It's quite hard for black to keep a grip on the bishop on d2. For example, if you go rook d2, I've just got rook a2 takes and rook takes. So after rook a1, we go queen d5 to try and keep that huge pressure on the bishop from these pieces. But now we can just go bishop takes g5, and after takes bishop e3. White's just winning this basically. Two bishops, we're going to win a pawn, and we've also got a kingside pawn majority. This one's weak as well. It's yeah, pretty much guaranteed to be a win, certainly in an engine game, and I'd expect pretty much at a good level human game as well. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why bishop e7 just isn't good. You can really forge ahead with knight e5, and then yeah, this attempt from black to give up a piece and hit white on all his exposed pieces just doesn't quite work. Quite surprised me in a way. I really thought that this might actually turn out okay for black, but yeah, no, not at all. So after castles, the most important thing for black then is to play bishop d6, not bishop e7. And you're going to see also in the game how important, covering this idea of knight e5 is. It's really white's biggest idea to get counterplay going. So this was probably the best thing that I could come up with, which was queen a6. So defending the pawn on a2. Attacking the pawn on c6, and then after castles I go rook c1, queen f5, and now rook b3. Necessary because obviously bishop c6 allows rook takes b1. But after I go rook b3, yeah, this is pretty decent for white, I think. I mean, the queen's attacking the pawn on a7 and c6. You're really likely to end up with an extra pawn. Now, of course, with an isolated queen's pawn, black's piece is reasonably active. It's not a clear extra pawn, but it is a nice advantage, I think. So yeah, and I think that improves a little bit over the correspondence game, which continued with rook c1, so not queen a6 defending the pawn a2 as I wanted, but played rook c1, and then queen a2 happened, knight e5. And now, what did the engines want to do? They wanted to play bishop takes c5, just like in the correspondence game. D takes c5, knight d5, rook a1, takes, and rook b7. And this is my main engine line, and was played in the game by Muyunen against Markoya, which they sound Finnish to me. Maybe Mr. Beads can confirm. And looks dodgy to me. You know, really, I look at this and I think, ooh, dark squares, especially after a move like queen g4, you know, g6, bishop h6, for example, takes queen a4. You know, my engines are saying that this is, you know, within tolerance levels, but I could easily imagine losing it. So, you know, it might actually be, you know, also a very good approach for white there. Although I think also after rook c1, I mean, you could just move the queen to f5, and then we could play queen a6 again, something like that. But I think one of those lines, you know, just generally does give white an advantage, but it's not half as huge as I would expect from this very risky line from black. But anyway, you know, queen c2 was also kind of possible. Queen a4 was played by Nemorino. It's quite a clever move again. I mean, what we're basically doing, we're keeping control of the c6 pawn and also keeping covering the a6 square. So again, you know, ideas of knight b6 are always in the air. And remember, you know, the bishop on b7 is pinned to the rook on b1, so you can't just remove it. And here Minic played the move knight e5. Investigated a lot of other things together with my engines. I mean, I wanted to. I was quite interested in the idea of playing castles in this position. So instead of knight e5, just castles here. And then we got a very interesting idea. You know, I mean, knight e5's a very big threat here. For example, if you just played a move like bishop e7, I go knight e5, takes, castles, and bishop c6, and well, we've managed to castle after chasing that queen away from a4. The rook on b1, it doesn't matter if you take it because the queen's attacked, and of course queen c6 allows rook b8. So yeah, very important here after castles that black plays bishop d6. And well, I let the new home ethereal 13.75 have a long run on this, and it found some very interesting lines, and also ran some engine games as well. And it's going into this line, c4, knight b6, very cunning, trapping the bishop on b7, but of course this is what the engines had foreseen. Takes, and castles. And yeah, you know, I mean, I was looking at this position, and it wasn't really clear to me that, you know, why white should be thinking of having any advantage here. I mean, you know, obviously this pawn's aggressive and you're going to have a bit of play around it, but yeah, you know, I mean, on the other hand, it could also just be weak, and black doesn't look that weak. Castle kingside as well. But yeah, my engines of course managed to keep things going. Rook c1 was one idea, knight e5 was another, and we were getting this sort of line: takes, rook b1 check, bishop e1, knight b6, rook c7, queen takes d4, knight f7, queen d5. Yeah, actually, I mean, you know, surprised me at how risky this ended up being for black. But somehow, knight g5, e5, rook e7, knight d7. You know, black managed to sort of hold the play there and pick up the pawn on d6 eventually, once this threat had been covered with queen c4 check, and you know, just chased away the knight from g5 first. And black managed to hold, but again, not a particularly comfortable hold, you know. And I think if you knew this well as white, it might be a, you know, an interesting thing to punt. The thing about knight e5 is that all of my engines were giving you know, plus 1.1, plus 1.2, 1.3, you know. So all the engines thought this was really strong for white. But actually, as it turns out, yeah, the resulting ending after some astonishing precision from Nemorino just seems to be pretty much equal. I find it amazing. So knight takes c5 played, queen e5, knight d7. And here there was a bit of a divergence. Stockfish was tending to play queen a5 in this position. Takes, bishop d6, king e2, c5, d5, takes, king e7, and playing for this ending. Yeah, I mean, white's, pardon me, a little bit more active. Two bishops, black pawns, maybe a little bit weaker, maybe a little bit easier to attack. Stockfish managed to win one of these. It was playing at a reasonably fast time control, 25 plus 10. Managed to win one of these against Komodo, but there were many draws. I mean, maybe it's one win in 15 games there. So, yeah, you know, it looks like black should be able to hold this. Though, you know, I wouldn't go into this as black for my pleasure, really, you know, because there's really only one result going to happen here. But, you know, at the engine level, this was, you know, completely acceptable way of achieving a draw, I think. Queen e4 was what Minic played, and this was Dragon's favourite move as well. And now an astonishing period of play. So black plays the move bishop c5. Now, why on earth would you play bishop c5 in this position, and after c3 go bishop d6? Why wouldn't you just play bishop d6 straight away? I mean, you know, to my mind, looking at this, the first thing that occurs to me is that c3 has defended d4 and has also protected the rook on b1 from the queen on e4. So, you know, that might give some extra possibilities for here even. You know, it just looks like a real wasted move. But actually, you know, the engines here were aiming for, well, you know, a very deep and forcing tactical sequence, and with a very important positional point at the end. Let's have a little look at that. So what happened? Castle kingside, more or less white's only move really. Rook takes b7, rook takes b7, knight c5. So a gorgeous idea, exploiting the pin on the d pawn. I mean, actual fact, you know, after d takes c5, got to be a little bit careful here. But well, analysing the train, I thought that taking on here, queen e4, rook b8, king e7, rook h8 and queen e2 would be fine for black. I haven't checked it with an engine, so let's hope that that was all right. The key point is after bishop g5 we go f6, and if rook b1 we go fg, and the king escapes just in time, and well, the queen's going to have a field day with all these split pawns. The reason I don't know whether it's true actually, but I got rather worried about this line, takes, castles and then d7. It looked like it could actually be quite nasty for white, for black rather. Not 100% sure about that. I think I was also analysing it with, well, you might start to see one difference here. I was analysing it whether in the line where black hadn't played bishop c5 straight away, but had just played bishop d6 straight away. And well, what you tend to notice in all these sorts of positions is that having this pawn on c2, it allows stuff like bishop a5, for example. So this bishop has a lot more scope to it. But anyway, after knight c5, Minic played rook takes a7, another brilliant counterstroke. So the idea is that you can take the queen and take the bishop, but then I've got rook a8 check, and I pick up the rook on h8. So queen a7 is forced. Queen c6 check, queen d7, looks like a great counter blow, takes, I take back with a knight, and the knight's protected. But queen a8 check, queen d8, takes if you don't want a repetition, takes and takes. And this ending is assessed as, you know, plus 1.1 by all my engines, including Stockfish and Komodo. But what you really notice here is the value of having played bishop c5 to force the move c3, rather than having played just bishop d6 immediately. Yeah, I mean the huge problem with what black has done by forcing c3 is that this bishop is not actually helping to support the a pawn. If this pawn was on a2, we could just play a4 to a5 and have this supported by the bishop on d2, and we'd have a really nice ending. And actually my engines were winning every single one of those with white. Put the pawn on c3, where it's unable to support a4 to a5 quickly, and every single game from here on was drawn. It's just amazing difference. It's really this move, bishop c5 is the difference between a loss and a reasonably comfortable draw. I mean, let's have a look how the game went. It was quite typical. I had many games with this in between Stockfish and Komodo. But they were, you know, kind of similar, actually almost identical, you'd say. King c7, rook a1, rook d8, rook a2, king c6. And what we do, we just bring this king in. I mean, if you played c4, you know, to try and give this pawn some support, this pawn is very, very close. So it's very easy to attack by the black king. So, Minic played king f1, king d5, a5, king c4, and the king is beautifully placed. So king e2, rook a8, a6, king b5. We just start harassing the pawn on a6. I mean, if you hadn't done anything, then we could just have started moving up the kingside pawns, getting space, looking to create a pass pawn of your own. So a6, king b5, c4. Now, interestingly enough, black just plays king b6. Doesn't bother taking this c-pawn, which would be a bit more risky, but just hangs on the a-pawn. Check, king a7, bishop c3, f6. And, with the king in front of the pawn attacking it, it means that this rook on a8 is no longer blocked now, no longer passive, having to restrain it. So now the rook can start looking to harass the white position as well. So h4, h5, f4, rook c8, bishop d2, bishop g1, and then we started getting some exchanges. And when you saw this position, you said, "Oh, Minic, you've messed up this ending." But actually, it looks like this was just a misassessment by all of the engines. They saw the very best continuation, but in actual fact, a more proper assessment of this position would have been almost equal. Quite amazing, really quite amazing to see that. I mean, again, it's something that's very, very hard to guess, unless you you play engine games with it. Just look searching for one of those games that that was played just with bishop d6, and I can show it to you. You'll just see the difference. So castles, rook b7, knight c5, takes, king e7 played, slightly different, but very, very similar effect in the end. Not bad, in fact, to put the bishop on c7, covering the a5 square. And now a4, king d7, rook a1, bishop e5, rook a2, king f1, rook a3, rook b3 check, bishop e3 played in this case, and here actually even just using that a pawn as a decoy, and the king is so far away here that and then this brilliant move, bishop h6. If you take on here, then rook f6, and rook g8, king e2, king c4, h4. The bishop stays hanging for multiple moves. Bishop e5, bishop f4, and white ended up winning it. But there are other games as well, just where having the pawn able to be supported by the bishop, for example, here in this position, a5, bishop d4, bishop e1, another stockfish against dragon game. Again, very, very hard for black to do anything. The c-pawn is lovely and safe, can't be attacked by the black king. The bishop's performing a super job, also able to emerge on this diagonal, whenever it wants. And the a pawn securely defended, which leaves the white rook free to do all sorts of other work. So a very, very interesting opening. There might just be one final question that might have occurred to you. It's in the opening after knight f6, bishop d3. Why is c6 so popular here, and why doesn't black play immediately bishop f5? Is it the move b4? Not exactly, in actual fact. After bishop f5, we've got the very cunning idea queen f3, hitting the bishop f5 and the pawn on b7. And the very amusing little point is that if you go bishop d3, I go queen takes b7, and if bishop e4, which looks like gloriously covering the rook on a8, exploiting the pin on the knight on c3, then queen c8 check is checkmate. So after queen f3, the best you've got is to go back to c8, which is obviously not ideal. So just looks like this move, 5 bishop d3, prevents black playing the bishop to f5 in the Queen A5 Scandinavian, which was something kind of unknown to me, I have to say. So there we are. I hope you enjoyed that. If you liked the video, why not give a like, subscribe to the channel, take a look at my new book, The Silicon Road to Chess Improvement, which is full of stuff like this and an awful lot more. But otherwise, thanks very much for watching the video, and hope to see you at the next one. Thanks for watching.